Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History of Podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath. And today we'll be discussing the synoptic problem Q and and how that relates to the historical Jesus. So, James, we've had similar conversations like this before on the show, and I've had similar conversations with other scholars about this. And thus, my first question would be: is solving the synoptic problem linked with historical Jesus reconstruction?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Um, yeah, implicit, I think, in your question or what you avoided saying because you're far too polite for that sort of thing, is that scholars spend a lot of time discussing, debating, pondering whether a source that may or may not have existed, and what its contents might have been, and all that kind of stuff. And so, your question is really getting at the heart of it. What's the point? Is it relevant? How much difference would it make if this thing existed, if it didn't exist? And ultimately, I think the difference that it makes is the same one that understanding the relationship between Matthew and Mark, understanding the relationship between Luke and Mark makes. If Mark is a late digest of Matthew and Luke, working with both of them and discovering he likes just the bits that they agreed on, and only some of those bits. And then Mark is further removed. Matthew and or Luke give us a perspective closer in time to the historical Jesus, and that's going to give us a different portrait potentially than if Mark is first and the others use Mark. That said, it's not automatically the case that someone writing later, especially if we're talking about slightly later, is so far removed from the events that they have no independent knowledge of historical material, right? And so ultimately, I think it's important if we want to get as precise as possible, but ultimately, there's good reason to think that Mark, Matthew, and Luke, whether through written sources, whether through oral tradition, had access to material that pertains to the historical Jesus. Not precise reporting, not something like modern day um, you know, court transcript made in the moment or video recording, but the kinds of things that we could reasonably expect from ancient sources pertaining to an ancient individual. So, in one sense, I don't think it makes such a radical difference that the historical Jesus would be someone completely different than scholars understand him to be. On the other hand, getting the because so many people care intensely, love him or hate him, they care intensely about this figure. Getting it as getting an as accurate a portrait as possible is important to large numbers of people, and that's what we're trying to do with the exploration of sources, both in terms of which of the Gospels knew the others that we know of, and what other sources might they have had that we no longer have.
So, what is your take on the fact that it seems like more scholars, at least slowly but over time, seem to be doubting Q and favoring the idea that Luke knew Matthew or the reverse, Matthew knew Luke? What are the implications of this?
Yeah, so I think regardless of whether there's a Q source, looking at material that Matthew contains, if we conclude that Mark was written before Matthew, then looking at what Matthew does with Mark, expecting that Matthew will probably do something similar with other material that he uses, and expecting that, and then asking the same kinds of historical questions we ask, whether we ask them of Matthew or of Q. Is it likely that Matthew invented this? If Matthew didn't invent this, do we have reason to think it might plausibly go back to historical Jesus? Is it likely? Because it's unlikely to have been invented by any source of Matthew's, oral or written. And so ultimately, the procedure that historians have and historical scholars have been sort of fine tuning over the years would continue to be implemented and would continue to apply.
So now I want to ask you about Markan priority. How is Markan priority determined?
Yeah, so that's a great question. On the one hand, you'll often hear that Matthew and Luke tend to improve and polish Mark's writing, and anyone who has read something that a non-expert wrote using expert sources, like let's say a student assignment where the student assignment wasn't the greatest, will know that it's possible to use a source that has really polished expression in English and produce something that is less polished. So that sort of argument doesn't carry that much weight. But as we look at each detail, right, as we try to consider each instance, time and again we see places where the most likely direction is from Mark to Matthew rather than the reverse. And two of my favorite examples are the following. One is the account of John the Baptist's execution. Mark says that Herod Antipas calls him king and says Herod Antipas didn't want to kill John and was trying to protect him. And in the end, Herod is dismayed when the request comes that he grant the head of John the Baptist on a platter. In Matthew, Matthew is aware that Herod Antipas is not a king, he's a tetrarch, and is aware that it's much more plausible that Antipas wanted to kill John, and Josephus tells us the same thing. And so starts the story that way, and yet later on calls him king and has him sad when the request comes that he give John the Baptist's head on a platter. If he wants John dead, having someone else to blame and having an excuse should be a cause for delight, not sadness. And the fact that Matthew got his title correct, and yet at one of the points where Mark calls him king, simply includes that. The best explanation of that is what scholars sometimes call editorial fatigue, and you and I had a conversation about that a while back. Essentially, it means taking over not necessarily the exact words, but in the process of editing, missing that the substance of the material you're incorporating doesn't fit with the editing that you've been doing, right? It's just a hint of laziness, right, in how that's being transmitted. The other example that I think is particularly clear in terms of providing evidence that Matthew used Mark is in the material that we find in Mark 13, right, the prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem and or the end of history. And Mark has Jesus say, when you see the desolating sacrilege standing where it ought not be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Jerusalem flee. And Matthew has, when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those in Jerusalem flee. And so both have that editorial remark indicating direct literary dependence, right? Let the reader understand. Jesus might have said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. He wouldn't have said, let the reader understand. And yet, despite the fact that both include let the reader understand, Matthew has some things that help the reader understand, right? Spoken of by the prophet Daniel. If you don't get the reference to the desolating sacrilege, that's where you'll find it. And the desolating sacrilege will be in the holy place, right? Not just standing where it ought not to be. It is extremely unlikely that Mark, if Mark was copying from Matthew, would have kept let the reader understand and yet taken away some of the things that help one who is reading understand what this is referring to, right? And so it's much more likely that Matthew is adding to Mark, improving on what we find in Mark. And so details like that are what make the case, right? When you have more than one instance of this, it points in the direction of Markan priority, of Matthew using Mark.
So with Mark being placed as the first gospel, what does that do? What are the implications of that on historical Jesus reconstruction?
Yeah, so the general answer to that, the broad answer is that It just means that in each instance, when we're looking for the earliest source, then we turn to Mark first, and then turn to Matthew or Luke or others. There are plenty of uh, places where Matthew has something different than Mark, or Luke has something different than Mark, where the historian has to consider maybe the reason they have something different is because they always heard the story differently, and they're reverting it to the way they always heard it. And so it may be that Mark introduced something new, and Matthew or Luke reverts it, right? So the fact that Matthew and Luke are editing Mark doesn't automatically mean that Mark is always more historical, closer. But there are some places where we can see the trajectory, we can see the development. And one example that's near and dear to my heart, because it grabbed my interest and then I wrote about it, is in the accounts of the burial of Jesus. In Mark, we're told that Joseph of Arimathea was a righteous member of the ruling council who was eagerly expecting the kingdom of God. Doesn't make him a disciple or anything like that, just as he was a righteous, God revering member of the Jewish council. Takes Jesus' body, right, requests it and takes Jesus' body and does the bare minimum that the Jewish law required. So wraps it in a linen shroud and places it in a tomb, presumably a tomb that's nearby. And as we look at Matthew, Luke, and John, each of them tries to undo the dishonorable burial of Jesus. Uh, they also add other things. So Matthew adds guards on the tomb and then has to have the women going to the tomb, because that's part of the story that is in Mark that he's using, and yet they're going to look at the tomb. Why? Because if there are guards on it, and he's introduced these guards, then the women obviously are not going to be able to get into the tomb to anoint Jesus' body and undo the dishonorable burial. Matthew and Luke also add things like Joseph of Arimathea being a disciple in secret, it being a tomb in which no one had ever been laid, even making the linen sheet a clean one, right? Emphasizing those kinds of things. And so we can see how there's a trajectory that Mark gives us something that was disconcerting for the followers of Jesus. The fact that he had been dishonored, not just by being executed by the Romans and put to a shameful death, but dishonored in how he was buried. And so things like that, if we started with Matthew or Luke or John, we would probably lose that altogether. And many readers of the New Testament who simply blur these accounts because they've read all of them or have heard all of them at some point are likely to miss that the most likely historical scenario is that Jesus was buried dishonorably.
Could you expand more on why it's more likely that Jesus was buried dishonorably rather than put into a tomb?
Yeah, sure. So on the one hand, right, if we're tracing the development from earliest to later, and if Mark is earliest, then that's the impression we get. Mark relates that a woman anointed Jesus beforehand for burial, which was not the norm, right? Like while he's still alive, but she pours perfume on him, and he interprets it as her anointing him beforehand for burial. And then women go to the tomb to anoint him after the fact, which again was not the custom. And both of those things only make sense if Jesus was not anointed for burial. And when Joseph of Arimathea, doing what the law requires, making sure that the Jewish law observed, as was his responsibility as a member of the Jewish ruling council, ensures his burial, we're just told that he was wrapped in a linen, had Jesus wrapped in a linen sheet and placed in a tomb. So no spices, no honor, and there's an effort to undo this. And it's interesting that as the tradition develops, eventually we get to the Gospel of John, in which Nicodemus is also a secret follower of Jesus, and he and Joseph of Arimathea take a huge amount of spices, right, and give Jesus essentially a burial fit for a king. And so, uh, in crucifixion, right, it was not just execution, right? There were simpler ways of killing someone if you wanted wanted someone dead. It was shameful, right? People were exposed there, put up for all to see, and it was a warning to anyone else. You know, you want to claim you're king of the Jews? This is what will happen to you. right? Mess with Rome, disobey the law, this is what will happen to you. And in other parts of the world, the Romans might have, you know, and even in this part of the world, if it had been left entirely up to them, Romans might not have given Jesus or anyone else a burial at all. Right? And just dishonored the person, dishonored the criminal further by leaving their body exposed. Josephus tells us that for Jews, burial was so important that even the crucified, right, they ensure are buried before sundown on the day that they die. And if that had been neglected, if that had been disallowed by the Roman authorities regularly, as a matter of course, then we would almost certainly hear about it in our sources, right? When the Romans ignored Jewish sensibilities about depictions of gods, depictions of animals and other figures, bringing their standards, right, their legionary standards, these depictions of eagles and the flags and things, into Jerusalem, there were objections, there were protests, and so if this thing that was so important to Jews because of the Jewish law, the burial of the dead, was prohibited by the Romans, interfered with by the Romans, we could reasonably expect that to leave some trace in the record. And so there's good reason to think that the Jewish authorities did ensure burial, and most likely Jesus and others who were buried on this spot would have been placed into a tomb of some sort that would be used for the burial of criminals in that place.
So now I want to ask you about Paul, because Paul states that Jesus was buried and he rose from the grave in 3 days. He doesn't mention the tomb. Would you say that Paul Paul is providing some evidence there that there was no tomb narrative prior to Mark that is known, and he didn't know about it? And that could that support it? So in other words, does that support the idea of a dishonorable burial?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Paul doesn't say so, explicitly, just as he was buried. Um, if you were crucified and no one intervened somehow to prevent the norm happening, then a dishonorable burial is to be expected. Uh, Paul does assume that Jesus was buried, right? If he uses that term, in theory, could have been in a trench grave or some other situation. The reason I'm inclined to think that there was probably something like a cave that was used, something we might call a tomb that could be covered by a rock. Uh, there are multiple reasons. One is the gospel accounts that suggest that that was the sort of tomb that was used. That on its own would not be enough. But there's also some reason to think that the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre might indeed be the place that Jesus was buried. So there are lots of churches in the Holy Land where Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, came and said, "Did anything important happen here?" And the locals were not foolish enough to say, "No, sorry." They said, "Oh, over here, right? You can still see, Simon Peter's butt print on this rock," or things like that, right? Build a church here. And so most of the locations that are identified as the sites of this or that, we have good reason to doubt, simply by the nature of what tour guides seem to have always done. The case of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is an interesting exception because in the time of the the mother of Emperor Constantine's visit to the Holy Land with a view to building churches and identifying holy sites, there was a temple of Aphrodite on the site, and it was inside the walls of Jerusalem. So it's even if you can say, well, the Christians might have said, "Hey, this is a good opportunity to get this temple demolished and build a church." It's inside the walls of Jerusalem, and the story said that Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem, and so it's not a likely place for them to invent. And at the time, they didn't have an explanation. But because that was what the local Christians said, this was the place. They went with it and accepted it. It was only later through archaeological research and correlation of that with texts that realized that the walls of Jerusalem had been expanded to include this area between the time of the death of Jesus and that later period. And when the platform of the temple of Aphrodite was removed, they found tombs underneath, right? They found burial niches and things like that. And so it's clear that there was a site there that was used for burial. And not one family grave, but something that we might call a graveyard or a network of caves that might have been used by both by families, but also at one point in this network of caves in the limestone there, used for burying those who were executed on the site. And so that strikes me as, more likely than not, given the circumstances. Right? It seems unlikely that they would have been able to invent this spot, would have invented a place inside the walls, and there would have been tombs underneath, unless there was some actual memory that was preserved by local people. And then when you consider all of that, I think that in itself would be enough to point us in the direction of um, something like a tomb being used, a cave, something tomb-like being used, but not a family tomb or of the sort that the later Gospels suggest. The third thing is that the rockiness of this area, right? So that was an abandoned limestone quarry in the time of Jesus, and so imagine if you have a lot of the terrain like that, right? So you have limestone rock very close to the surface. It's going to be very hard to dig a trench grave every time somebody's executed there. And so the likelihood that they might have used this site precisely because then you could toss the bodies into the cave and bury the executed criminals there makes a lot of sense in terms of just the practicality. And so, as Mark Goodacre has pointed out in a recent article, talking about the empty tomb is something that historians need to move away from. Even if you think somebody went on that first morning after Sunday morning after the crucifixion and didn't find the body there, they were looking in a tomb that was used for multiple burials, right? And we have to take into account all the challenges that would involve. And so should move away from thinking of it as an empty tomb. It's only the later tradition trying to undo in the storytelling some of the dishonor perpetrated against Jesus and how he was buried and how he was executed that makes it a tomb in which no one had ever been laid.
So, how did Jesus' followers come to think that he rose from the dead, in your view? What caused this belief that he rose from the dead?
Well, isn't that a question? The short answer is that we have stories of people having experiences of what they describe as seeing Jesus. And the accounts that we have, including some of the later ones, like the Gospel of John, don't depict the kinds of things that we would expect. They don't depict the kinds of things that would naturally lend themselves to supporting the claim in the Gospel of John and also in some stories in the Gospel of Luke. Those who see Jesus don't recognize him as Jesus. I mean, the Gospel of John says no one had to ask him who he was; they knew it was the Lord. That's not something you say if it looks like him, right? And so there's something odd there. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's an account of him appearing to the 11. And it says, when they saw him, they worshipped, but some doubted. Which again, it's like, if you saw him and it's clearly him, why are you doubting? And then we have Paul saying that Jesus appeared to him and not making a distinction between how he saw Jesus and how others saw him. And so whether we had, very early morning encounters, sightings from a distance where they're pretty sure they spotted him in a crowd, dreams, what we might call the postmortem sort of experiences of thinking you've seen this person that you love that has died, something that's well documented, does not normally lead to belief in the the person having been raised from the dead does often lead to them to the belief that they've entered an afterlife. And so, what may have combined with that to lead to the doctrine of the resurrection, and I'm speaking here historically, right, because that's the only way we can approach this. I mean, obviously, one can say, "Oh, well, a miracle happened, and something completely unprecedented happened," and one can choose to believe that, but a historian can't do that, and that includes a Christian historian, right? Somebody who has some sort of Christian faith doesn't allow you to bypass the fact that historical study deals with evidence and with cause and effect and with these kinds of things, with probabilities. And so it may well be that Jesus spoke of the nearness of the end, right? And that the resurrection of the dead, meaning the resurrection of all the dead and the final judgment, would soon follow. He may have believed that by the time his death was drawing near, that in fact he was going to be apprehended, and whether he'd be rescued before it happened or whether he'd be rescued from death after it happened, may have even given some indication that he believed that the death of those that God had sent to this final generation, the deaths of John, his mentor, and then Jesus himself, would provoke God's intervention. Right? God would not sit by allowing his anointed one and his prophet to be mistreated in this way, and would bring about the final resurrection, the final judgment. And if Jesus had spoken about that as something that should be expected, then thinking they've seen Jesus, having experiences that they interpret as seeing Jesus, combined with that preparation, might be what led to the experiences being interpreted in this really rather unique way. So, historically speaking, that's one possibility.
So now I want to go back to Q, the double tradition material in Matthew and Luke. What does that material tell us about the historical Jesus? What can it tell us?
So Q, you'll often hear that it is a saying source, and it's mostly sayings, but the Q material, as we see it poking through Matthew and Luke, right? Because Q ultimately means the material that Matthew and Luke share that's not in Mark. It starts with John the Baptist, right, and stories about him. And there's other material that are stories, and a lot of it has to do with John the Baptist. And so, one thing that the Q material tells us, whether you think it got into Matthew and Luke via written source or oral tradition, or direct use of one by the other, there's no reason to think that Matthew or Luke invented all of this content. It tells us that there was a close connection between Jesus and John the Baptist. And we get that from the account of his baptism, right, which is also in Mark, but there's enough shared material between Matthew and Luke at that point that most think that there was an account of the baptism. But at the very least, Jesus is connected with John the Baptizer and views him as the greatest person who ever lived. And it's unlikely that Jesus would have held that view of John and yet never embraced his baptism and his movement. And so the Q material tells us, confirms to us, gives us a strong impression that Jesus was part of John's movement, one of John's followers, who steps into the role of leadership, just as Mark also indicates, after John's death. Now, the death of John, whether that appeared in the Q material at all is harder to say. There may be some things that hint at it, but the story, the famous story, is only told in Mark, and is one of the things in the Gospels that, despite being very vivid, one has to have some serious doubts about historically. But the material in Mark and the material in the Q tradition both converge on the close connection between Jesus and John the Baptist.
So if one were to suppose that there was no Q, how would you think that Matthew and Luke got that material? If Luke knows Matthew, where did Matthew get it from? And would that take away from what the double tradition says about Jesus, or not really?
Um, I mean, it would what it would then become is material that Matthew had that wasn't in Mark, that Luke, right, assuming Luke writes later, which is the majority view, although it's not the only view, if you that involves direct dependence between Matthew and Luke, or Luke and Matthew. But would have whichever of them borrowed from the other, recognizing this material as particularly worth including, right? So they don't include everything, right, that the other has. Luke has, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. Matthew has the sheep and the goats. Uh, Whichever one you think is using the other is doing much more reworking and being much more selective with the other gospel than they are with Mark. And yet this material was considered worth including. And so was recognized as having a certain importance, a certain significance, a certain relevance, perhaps. And so how that would be interpreted would depend on the individual historian. How it made it to these gospels is another interesting question, right? Because there's there has to be literary dependence in Greek, because in the Lord's Prayer, which is the kind of thing you'd expect could be passed on by oral tradition, because prayers become known. You could ask probably half the people in the world today to recite the Lord's Prayer, and they'd rattle off Matthew's version and something very similar to one another. And so those are the kinds of things that people often memorize. But there's this word in it in Greek that's not found in any Greek literature prior to the Gospels. And things like that, as well as agreements in order, suggest literary dependence. And so if we want to posit direct dependence, I think there are two options. One is that with material that came from oral tradition and some invention on the part of the gospel author and editing and whatever else we want to envisage, this material comes together, and then the gospel author comes along later, uses it and adapts it in their own way. It seems to me possible, and it's a scenario I've been thinking that either I or someone else maybe should revisit, that let's say Luke used Matthew. Some of Luke's versions of sayings seem more primitive, like more original than Matthew's. Like they seem to lack some of Matthew's editing and elaboration. And so either at those points, Luke already knows some of this material, maybe knows it orally, and is reverting it to the what they think is the more original version and undoing some of Matthew's edits. Or just as Luke prefers Mark to Matthew, recognizing that Mark was used by Matthew, and because Mark is Matthew's source, it's better to turn to Mark where they agree. Luke may have also had another source that was used by the Gospel of Matthew, right? And so you could have Luke using something that essentially is the Q source and the Gospel of Matthew, and then you'd have an explanation for why Luke sometimes prefers what seems like a more primitive, more original version of some of Matthew's material, and yet also converges with Matthew in places. So that's a scenario that's certainly it's I'm not the first to mention it or to think of it, but it's one that hasn't been explored that much, because most say, well, if we've got the use of Q, then we may as well assume they're independent. If there's direct dependence, that we don't need to talk about what other sources they might have had. There's the famous saying, it's been attributed to Albert Einstein, although I've not seen any evidence that it comes from him. Jesus is not the only one who has things attributed to him that are of dubious authenticity. But the saying goes, make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. And clearly, if just positing a direct relationship, or Matthew, Luke, Mark, and Q solved all the problems, then scholars would have said, hey, great, And obviously, scholarship, academic work depends on, we have to publish stuff, which means we have to try out new ideas. And so, but clearly things like the historicity of Jesus, there are things that we're perfectly happy to except for the most part, and saying this seems most likely. And so if Q were an open and shut case, or Matthew's use of Luke, or Luke's use of Matthew, or any of these were a clear-cut case where there are no loose ends left by positing that, then there'd be much stronger agreement than there is. And so it seems to me that there are other scenarios that are more complicated, but are worth exploring, because the simpler solutions clearly haven't tied everything up neatly.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about just because Mark is first, appears to be the first of the four canonical Gospels, does not necessitate that everything in Mark is more historical than what came later. It doesn't mean that everything that came later is just made up. So, what would your response be to somebody that said, okay, everything in Matthew and Luke, especially John, that's different from them, is made up because they came later than Mark?
Yeah. So one example, I think I stuck this in a footnote in one of my books about John the Baptist, because the same thing can come up there, and has come up, particularly with respect to, say, the Mandaean sources, other sources that come along later. If you look at one of the published editions, maybe the only one that published so many of his papers, but the publication of the sayings and sermons and writings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the ones about civil rights are in the early volumes. And if you only had those and only went with those, you might say, so clearly he was an activist, and the religious stuff, like praying and things like that, it doesn't feature as much. But in some of the later volumes, we have some of his prayers and some of his other, some other sermons, and he actually did preach on other topics, right? It was not only one thing that he talked about all the time. And sometimes the early publication of things that have particular content has to do with the historical moment and what's considered important. It doesn't mean that things that are left out at that stage necessarily are unhistorical. The fact that they're written down later doesn't mean that they're historical either, right? We have to ask those questions. We have to sift through them. We have to evaluate them. But the mere fact that something is not included in the first thing to be written does not automatically mean that the person said and did nothing else. And even when we have piecemeal sources, Dale Allison has used the example of the famous Rabbi Hillel. Apparently, there's no specific mention of the word God placed on his lips in the rabbinic tradition. We can be pretty confident he talked about God, right? I mean, this is a rabbi, and so it probably is just the fact that we only have a relatively limited selection of things. Right? So the fact that not everything gets included, even when there's a longer period of time, when we're dealing with a time before widespread literacy and record keeping, but also the fact that we can look at other historical examples and see where things that we know came from an individual were eventually published, but not right away, not in that first wave of publication. So I think that those kinds of examples and those kinds of considerations are among the reasons why we would expect that there would be some staggered publication of Jesus' sayings, his actions, and that perhaps even later than the New Testament Gospels, some of the so-called agrapha, right, the unwritten sayings that do eventually get mentioned by other Gospels, right? The Gospel of Thomas has been considered in this regard. Things are quoted in the Church Fathers where they seem to have heard something attributed to Jesus, and yet it's not there. Some of those things might come from him, right? And the further away we get, the less likely it's going to be intrinsically that someone has remembered things. And yet we have examples both of things being invented, like the day something happens, a rumor starts, right? And nobody can seem to stamp it out. And we also have examples of stories being told, true stories or false, but being passed along and showing up again with no apparent literary connection, just sort of folktale and things like that, but the same story is still circulating. And so people were capable both of inventing and of passing along stories for very long periods of time. And so we can't assume ahistoricity because something's late. We can't assume historicity because something is early. We just have to ask, what's the evidence? Do we have good reason to think this was invented? Do we have good reason to think it's unlikely to have been invented? What's the evidence? And to discuss each instance on its own merits, right? And that's the thing that I think oftentimes is, makes historical Jesus study seem tedious to the layperson who would like to just say, okay, Mark's the earliest, so I'll just go with Mark. Well, no, right? I mean, that Herod Antipas was king and liked John the Baptist, that's in Mark. It's also not plausible given what we know about Herod Antipas. We have other things that are written later, including Josephus, right? Josephus writes later, but we have good reason to think that Josephus and Matthew both give us some more accurate information. And so we just have to go through that tedious process of evaluating each piece of evidence on its own merits. Right? If you read a biography of George Washington, like an older one, right? The recent ones probably won't do this, but you read an older one, it may have a story about the cherry tree, right, from when he was young, and also have his actual speeches and things for which there are records. That combination of fabrication and historicity is there in ancient biographical writings, in modern ones, and we try to avoid that, but probably even the most recent, most critical biographies of individuals include some things that may have been stories that got elaborated over time and may have changed. That's just the nature of the enterprise. We do our best.
Well, James, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure as always, Jacob. Thanks for talking to me. Our conversation went in all kinds of directions that I don't think either of us expected, but hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I definitely did, and I want to just let everybody know real quick that the links to purchase James McGrath's books will be in the description below in the pinned comment. Thanks again, James.
Thank you, too.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.